This second segment focuses on socioeconomic status, health, and the social gradient in health. And so we'll move from the question of what is social class to the question of what is socioeconomic status, and particularly how we use it, conceptualize it, and operationalize it in social epidemiology. And what we're doing here by moving from social class to socioeconomic status is basically tracking how we go from a very complicated conceptualization and model for the workings of social structure to trying to capture, in essence, where people are located within that social structure. And in doing so, we're adhering much more to the attribution, social stratification model of rights rather than either of the other relational two models, which is a regrettable sacrifice, not as a result of disinterest or a lack of attention to the importance of the relational workings of social class, but just more out of necessity in terms of what we can operationalize and incorporate into investigations of population health outcomes. So what it begins to look like is simply the location of an individual within social structure as a function of both economic and social factors. And we wind up using aggregate or composite measures that capture both the material and social kinds of resources, such as income, wealth, education, and social networks, as well as prestige resources capturing things that are more akin to rank or status in a social hierarchy, which gets into something that's much more perceptual and subjective rather than the possession or access to very concrete types of material and social resources. In the literature, you'll often sometimes see this distinction between SES, socioeconomic status, and SEP, or socioeconomic position. For the most part, this is not a consequential distinction. It's a vernacular distinction. Nancy Krieger argues that the latter is more adherent to a model of socioeconomic position reflecting material resources and dynamics, and that socioeconomic status, relatively speaking, privileges the more perceptual status types of resources, and she being someone who adheres more to the material resource models to understand how social class affects health is more likely to use the term socioeconomic position, or SEP. When we go from looking at socioeconomic status to health and the relationship between them, the idea that poverty, absolute poverty, really acute deprivation, low socioeconomic status are things associated with poor health is very intuitive, very obvious, and not difficult to defend. It's fairly indisputable. But in social epidemiology, we recognize that that relationship is actually much more complicated, and there are several dimensions of that relationship that I will review with this segment. In essence, the relationship between SES and health is 1, incremental, 2, evident above a level of acute material deprivation, 3, not explained by traditional proximate risk factors, modifiable, and finally, bidirectional. And we'll be going through each of these dimensions of the relationship between SES and health in turn. So to go with the first, the incremental relationship, the incremental nature of that relationship, we'll contrast this, again, rather intuitive, crude depiction of how you'd expect SES and health to be related. If you're poor, you're more likely to have lower life expectancy, shorter survival relative to someone who is in this other category of this binary construction, rich. But in truth, it becomes very quickly something that looks more graded or granular. So here's a classic example that vividly illustrates the relationship between social class and survival, the Titanic. And you can see that especially when you just look at the total mortality or total survival percentages for men, women, and children aggregated, you can see that there is this graded relationship between social class, with the highest level of survival in first class, followed by the second class, and finally by third class, with the crew in aggregate looking much more like the third class rather than the other two. You see a couple of other things here as well, of course. Women's survival vastly greater than men, so chivalry is a bitch. But we also see that the relationships between class and survival, while clean in the aggregate, get a little bit more messy when we look at the subgroups. Children, of course, being the most stark example, where the survival was exactly the same between the first and second classes and then drops off precipitously in the third class. Again, more clumping up here of survival between the first and second classes, greater parity among women with another major drop. And then this kind of anomalous finding here that in the grade, in that second class survival was lower than third class survival, which was in turn lower than crew survival here, which probably reflected the capacity to know how to get off the boat, if nothing else, relative to first class men, which relative to the other groups was very low. So you see the cleanest grade here in this total survival picture here, with incremental increases in survival as you go up the social classes. And if we go from that cute little analogy to the real picture, we see that in fact, empirically, higher SES is associated with better health compared to lower SES at every level. And the fact of this relationship, this graded relationship, is the essence of the social gradient in health, and becomes kind of an important challenge for social epidemiologists or anybody who's trying to understand this relationship between SES and health in ways that captures the real empirical picture that is consistently demonstrated in the data. And so this challenge reflects the fact that this takes us away from the intuitive, obvious fact of poverty being bad for health and makes us look for explanations of the relationship between SES and health that apply even at higher levels of socioeconomic status, above levels where acute deprivation, when basic material needs are wanting. So in fact, rather than that crude binary dichotomous picture that I showed previously, here we've actually got something that looks more like this. Now, some real-world examples from using real data show that it's not a clean linear line like this, but in some cases gets pretty close to it. Here you see death rates in Scotland in 2001 among men and women. And you can see that on this scale, which is a graded scale of deprivation, those who are least well off at this end and the most well off at this end. And what you see is that for both men and for women, there is a graded relationship between deprivation and death. Of course, what you also see here is that that graded relationship, the slope of that connection, that line here, is much, much steeper among men than it is among women, but it is still evident among women. Another even more granular example is shown here out of Michael Marmot's report in 2010, looking at life expectancy and disability-free life expectancy by neighborhood deprivation. Here is the deprivation index, the most deprived, least deprived, and this is a very difficult graph to really read with any specificity, but basically the take-home point here is the granularity in the relationship, that even when you make it evident by virtue of using a scale that's as granular as this one, you still see this very subtle slope of higher life expectancy and disability-free life expectancy among those that are least deprived relative to those with more deprivation below them. Some of the earliest evidence of this social gradient came from the Black Report in the UK in 1977, which looked at mortality by social class in the early 70s. And they used these 5 different categories of social class that correspond to different types of occupations, the unskilled being the lowest on up to the professional class at the highest, and found this really stark graded relationship between social classes in the expected direction, as we would expect it now. And at the time, the explanations that were posited to try to understand why mortality would be differential across social classes were mostly behavioralist and also materialist. So looking at assuming differences in health behaviors like smoking, drinking, diet, etc. Across social classes, but also looking at and assuming that there are differences in accesses to important material resources across social classes. And of course, another key early and ongoing source of empirical evidence and inquiry around the social gradient in health comes from the White Health Study, which you heard about in the first segment from the Unnatural Causes documentary series. And of course, some of the key strengths and features of the White Health Study are the fact that this is relatively speaking, a relatively homogeneous population with respect to the major drivers of health. In other words, this is all white-collar professional people working in the British civil service. You're not making comparisons in health outcomes between professional bureaucrats and coal miners. So a lot of the really important drivers known to affect health status and health differences across occupational categories are controlled for by virtue of restriction, that you're limiting it to this British civil service population. All of them have somewhat comparable work environments, at least in terms of the physical plant and the kinds of physical exposures they might be subjected to. They all have access to health care, health insurance, and so forth through the national healthcare system. So a lot of these things are taken out of the picture as explanatory factors by virtue of restriction. But what you also have is within the British civil service a hierarchy with very distinct status differences, so that it's possible to meaningfully rank individuals in ways that delineate distinctions of social hierarchies. And as such, with that ranking, you get some granular picture of social class differences. And what you find what has been observed looking at Whitehall data repeatedly is large differences across occupational categories in terms of health outcomes, despite accounting for key risk factors, in addition to accounting for the other factors that are controlled for by virtue of restriction. So accounting for proximal behavioral risk factors, proximal health conditions, risk factors like blood pressure, etc., have shown repeatedly that they can't fully explain the observed differences in health outcomes across occupational categories. Here's one example of that using only 4 of the occupational categories. In this case, this is the highest, this is the lowest, and what you have is all-cause mortality by year of follow-up. And so here you can see that this highest social occupational category, administrative, has the lowest all-cause mortality relative to the others in a nice sort of stepwise fashion. Here also data from Whitehall, but subdivided by age categories in the same professional occupational groups. You see that across age categories, you again see this graded relationship with the highest mortality among the lowest occupational category in each one, and the lowest mortality in these highest professional categories up here across all age groups. Obviously, some differences in the absolute levels of mortality, as would be expected, and somewhat differences in the steepness of the gradient as well. But the gradient is evident across all age groups. Here, when you go beyond Whitehall, but look at differences, again, just another example, another way of capturing social gradients in health, looking at under 5 mortality by wealth group. Here are the categories used across completely different contexts. These are different countries, and what you see is that in each country, very comparable types of gradients are evident even for under 5 mortality.